in a courtyard behind the École de Physique in Paris, where cobblestones held centuries of rain and the walls remembered older sciences, there stood a shed that had once stored corpses for medical dissection. Its roof leaked. Its windows, few and grimy, admitted light that seemed already exhausted by the journey through glass that had forgotten how to be transparent. The floor was packed earth. The walls were thin planking that did nothing against winter cold or summer heat. It was not a laboratory. Was barely a shelter. Was the kind of space that institutions provide when they do not quite believe in the work, when they offer permission but not support, when they say yes but mean we shall see. Into this shed, in 1898, came Marie Curie carrying equipment she and Pierre had borrowed or built themselves, carrying questions about radiation that had no answers yet, carrying the determination that would consume the next 4 years of her life, and though she did not know it then, would begin the slow consumption of her body, her health, the very substance of her being. The shed had no ventilation except the gaps in the walls, had no proper apparatus except what they could improvise, had nothing except space and the bare permission to pursue work that seemed to most observers like chasing phantoms, like trying to isolate something that might not exist, that left traces on photographic plates, but resisted all attempts at capture, at concentration, at proof. She would work in this shed through winters so cold that liquids froze in their containers, through summers so hot that breathing itself felt like labor. Would spend days stirring massive cauldrons of pitchblende residue, tons of it, boiling and filtering and precipitating, and repeating the process hundreds of times, working toward concentrations of something she believed existed, but could not yet see, could not yet hold, could not yet prove except through the faintest signatures that might be imagination, might be error, might be the universe revealing its deepest secret to someone willing to work in darkness and cold and exhaustion beyond what any reasonable person would consider sustainable. The shed became her world, became the only reality, became the place where light was being born from darkness through processes that required not inspiration, but endless, grinding, exhausting physical labor that would mark her permanently. That would begin the transformation of Marie Curie from young scientist into something else, someone who had touched the invisible and been burned by it. Someone who had pursued understanding past the point where pursuit becomes destruction. Someone who would glow, literally glow, with the substance she had discovered, but at a cost that would only become fully visible years later when the glowing meant not triumph but toxicity, not discovery but damage, not light born from darkness but darkness dressed as light. It is said that Marie Curie's hands were beautiful once, before the work, before the radium, before the years of handling substances that seemed harmless because they glowed so gently, because they emitted warmth that felt almost maternal, because they left traces on skin that looked like faint sunburn, uncomfortable perhaps, but surely not dangerous, surely not the kind of damage that accumulates silently, invisibly. That writes itself into tissue and bone and blood in languages the body cannot read until much later, until the damage is complete, until recovery becomes impossible, and all that remains is management of decline. Her hands touched everything during those years in the shed, touched the pitchblende residue that she boiled in massive iron cauldrons, stirring for hours until her arms ached, until her back screamed protest, until exhaustion made even standing difficult. Touched the precipitates that formed, the crystals that grew, the concentrations that increased slowly, infinitesimally, across months of work that would have broken most humans, but that Marie could not abandon because abandonment would mean admitting defeat, would mean acknowledging that perhaps the radium she sought did not exist, that perhaps she was chasing ghosts through processes that consumed her youth, her health, her hands that touched everything and were touched in return by radiation that had no color, no smell. No immediate sensation except the faint warmth and the glow that seemed magical, seemed like evidence of nature's generosity rather than nature's indifference. Nature's willingness to kill as easily as create if consciousness is foolish enough to pursue without protection, without caution, without recognition that some substances burn not through heat, but through time, not immediately but eventually, not dramatically, but with the slow patience of damage that does not announce itself until repair becomes impossible. Her fingers developed lesions, small at first, barely noticeable, easy to dismiss as the ordinary costs of physical labor, of handling chemicals, of working in conditions that were harsh but that seemed justified by the importance of the pursuit. But the lesions did not heal, grew deeper instead, became ulcers that would not close, that wept constantly, that made simple tasks writing, handling glassware, turning pages exercises in pain management, in determination, in the stubborn insistence that the hands could continue their work despite their wounds, that damage was acceptable if it served the discovery, that suffering was simply cost, and cost was justified by achievement. She wrapped her hands in bandages and continued working. This is what the accounts tell us. That even when the pain made her gasp, made tears come unbidden, made simple movements into ordeals, she continued. Because the work demanded it. Because the radium was there, was real, was finally beginning to reveal itself in concentrations that could be measured, that could be proven, that could transform her pursuit from questionable obsession into legitimate science, if only she could continue, if only her hands could hold out, if only the damage could be managed or ignored or simply endured until the work was complete. Beneath the surface of her scarred hands lived a deeper truth. That discovery requires touch, requires physical engagement with materials that may not be safe, may not be kind, may burn even as they illuminate. Marie's hands held fire, held it literally as the radium glowed in darkness, as the samples emitted their gentle, deadly light. Held it figuratively, as the heat of radioactive decay slowly cooked the tissue, slowly poisoned the blood, slowly began the process that would eventually kill her, though she did not know this yet. Could not know, because radiation's effects were still mysterious, still unstudied, still the kind of danger that reveals itself only after generations have been damaged, after enough evidence accumulates that ignorance becomes inexcusable. Where memory fades into the medical records that remain fragmentary, we find descriptions of her hands in later years cracked, scarred, burned beyond recognition. Fingers that had once been slender and graceful transformed into something that looked like it had passed through flame, that bore the permanent marks of having touched what should not be touched, of having held what burns not through temperature, but through transformation, through the invisible radiation that rearranges atoms, that damages DNA, that kills cells slowly and systematically, while the consciousness inhabiting those cells remains unaware, remains focused on the work, remains convinced that the burns are acceptable price, are manageable cost, are simply the way science proceeds when you pursue it past the comfortable boundaries into territories where knowledge exists but safety does not. Did she regret her hands? Did she look at them in her final years and wonder if the radium had been worth the price they paid? The evidence suggests she did not. Suggests she viewed the damage as simply part of the work, as the cost that had to be paid for understanding. But perhaps regret is not the right question. Perhaps what matters is recognition that the hands which held fire were also hands that held discovery, that bore witness to radiation's reality, that proved through their own destruction that the invisible forces she had pursued were real, were powerful, were capable of transforming not just matter, but the flesh that dared to manipulate matter, that insisted on touching despite the burns, that continued working even as the damage accumulated beyond repair, proving that some knowledge is written on the body. Some understanding requires sacrifice of the very hands that seek it. Some discoveries demand that we touch fire and accept the burns as evidence not just of danger, but of truth, of having reached into territories where nature guards its secrets with radiation that glows gently and kills slowly and marks forever the hands that dared to hold it. They would return to the shed sometimes after dark. Marie and Pierre would unlock the door and step into darkness absolute, into the space where their work lived, where the cauldrons and beakers and precipitates waited in silence. And in that darkness, if they waited, if they allowed their eyes to adjust, if they stood very still and looked carefully, they would see it. The glow. Faint at first, like starlight reflected in water, like phosphorescence in deep ocean, like something that might be imagination except that both saw it, both witnessed it, both knew that what they were seeing was real. Was their discovery manifesting not as theory but as visible light, as radiation made luminous through its interaction with air or glass or the salts they had isolated, glowing with its own energy, announcing its presence in darkness that made the glow seem magical. Seemed like evidence that they had found not just element but essence, not just substance but something fundamental, something that carried its own light into darkness, that needed no external source, that simply was glowing, eternal, beautiful beyond description, though the beauty was also danger, was also the visible signature of radiation that was slowly, invisibly, killing them. It is said that Marie would stand in the darkness of the shed on nights when exhaustion had made continued work impossible, when her body demanded rest, but her mind would not quiet, would not stop racing through calculations and possibilities and the next steps in isolation and purification. She would stand in that darkness watching the tubes and containers glow with their pale blue-green light, watching the radium announce itself in the only way it could, through electromagnetic emissions in frequencies that happen to fall within the narrow band that human eyes perceive as visible light. She described it as one of the most beautiful sights she had ever witnessed, this spontaneous luminescence, this self-generated radiance that required nothing, that simply existed as property of the element itself. But the beauty was deception. The glow was warning. The light that seemed so gentle was actually testimony to intense radioactive decay, to atoms literally tearing themselves apart, to energy so concentrated that it could expose photographic plates through layers of paper and metal, that could ionize air, that could penetrate flesh and bone and do damage that would not manifest for years, for decades, damage that was occurring even as she stood in the darkness admiring the glow, even as she reached toward the tubes with hands already scarred, even as she breathed air that carried radioactive particles, even as she remained in that shed hour after hour, night after night, mesmerized by beauty that was slowly killing her. Some believe the nights when radium glowed were the nights when Marie felt most alive, most connected to something beyond ordinary experience, beyond everyday science, beyond the prosaic work of boiling and stirring and measuring. In darkness, lit only by radiation's glow, in silence broken only by her breathing, in isolation complete except for the presence of the element she had discovered perhaps, she felt something that daylight could not provide, something that exhaustion made more acute, something that approached the mystical even though she would never have used that word, even though she understood the glow as physical phenomenon with rational explanation, even though she knew it was simply radiation, simply physics, simply nature operating by laws that made no accommodation for human awe or human fragility. Marked by those nights of watching radium glow, marked by the hours spent in darkness lit only by her discovery, marked by the beauty that was also toxicity, Marie's relationship with radiation became something more than scientific, became something that approached obsession, became something that made the damage seem acceptable because the glow was so beautiful. Because the nights when she could witness it were nights when understanding felt not like achievement, but like gift, like revelation. Like having been granted access to secrets that nature normally keeps hidden, that reveal themselves only to consciousness willing to work in darkness, willing to sacrifice sleep, willing to stand for hours watching light that carried no warmth, but that illuminated something more important than comfort, more essential than safety, the proof that she had been right, that the element existed, that the years of work had not been wasted, that the exhaustion and the burns and the sacrifice had produced something real, something that glowed in darkness and announced its reality through light that was also destruction, through beauty that was also danger, through radium that transformed everything it touched, including the woman who had discovered it. The glow persists even now, more than a century later. Her notebooks still glow faintly in darkness, still emit radiation that makes them dangerous to touch. That requires them to be stored in lead-lined boxes. That testifies to the contamination that occurred during those years of work without protection, without understanding, without recognition that the glow she found so beautiful was also the glow of her own slow destruction, that the nights when radium glowed were also nights when damage accumulated, when exposure built toward levels that would eventually prove fatal, when beauty and danger merged so completely that they became indistinguishable, became one thing, became the legacy of those nights when Marie stood in darkness watching radium glow, and did not know, could not know that what she was witnessing was not just the discovery of an element, but the announcement of her own mortality, the visible signature of radiation that would write itself into her bones, into her blood, into the very structure of her being, glowing still, glowing always, glowing long after the nights ended, long after the shed was demolished, long after Marie herself was gone, leaving only the glow beautiful, deadly, eternal, the nights when radium glowed and Marie watched and did not understand that the light she loved was the light that would eventually consume her. That would prove that some discoveries cannot be possessed without cost, that some elements glow precisely because they are destroying themselves, that some beauty is beautiful only because we do not yet understand what it signifies, what it costs, what it takes from those who pursue it into darkness where radium glows and consciousness watches, and death, patient and radioactive, begins its slow, inevitable work. In photographs from 1898, Marie Curie appears substantial, present, a woman of 29 who had recently married, who carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knows her own mind, who stands beside peer as equal rather than assistant, whose eyes suggest determination, but not yet the haunted quality that would come later, That would mark her face in photographs from the radium years. That would announce without words what the work was costing, what the pursuit was consuming, what the shed was slowly taking from her day by day, pound by pound, until colleagues who saw her after months of absence would struggle to recognize her, would wonder if this gaunt figure could really be the same woman who had arrived at the shed a year earlier, would see in her face something that went beyond ordinary exhaustion into territories where the body begins consuming itself, where work replaces nourishment, where obsession becomes the only sustenance consciousness recognizes. The weight fell away not suddenly, but steadily, imperceptibly at first, then undeniably, then alarmingly. She ate irregularly during the radium years, would forget meals entirely when work demanded attention, when a precipitation was forming, when concentrations needed to be measured at precise intervals that did not coincide with lunch or dinner, or the normal times when humans pause their work to fuel the bodies that make work possible. She would work through meals, would continue stirring or filtering or measuring, would prioritize the radium over the bread, the discovery over sustenance, the understanding over the basic maintenance that keeps flesh functional. Pierre noticed, would try to insist she eat, would bring food to the shed, would stand watching as she mechanically consumed whatever he offered while her attention remained entirely on the work, on the samples, on the questions that consumed her more thoroughly than any food could nourish her. He worried, expressed concern, but Marie dismissed it, treated the weight loss as simply the cost of intense work, as the price that had to be paid temporarily until the radium was isolated, until the proof was complete, until she could present the scientific community with evidence so undeniable that her work would be validated. Her position would be secured, her sacrifice would be justified by achievement. It is said that by 1902, after 4 years in the shed, Marie weighed barely more than 90 pounds, had lost perhaps 30 pounds from her already slender frame, had become almost transparent, had taken on the quality of someone being slowly erased, slowly consumed by forces invisible but inexorable. Her clothes hung loose. Her face had acquired the hollow quality that speaks of deprivation, of systems operating on reserves that were depleted, of a body cannibalizing itself to fuel consciousness that would not rest, that would not moderate its demands, that insisted on continuing the work despite increasingly desperate signals that continuation was unsustainable, that something fundamental was failing, that the weight falling away was not just pounds, but vitality itself, life force itself. The substance that makes existence something other than simply not yet dead. Beneath the visible weight loss lived physiological catastrophe. Her blood showed signs of anemia that would persist and worsen across years. Her immune system, compromised by radiation exposure and malnutrition, made her vulnerable to infections that her body struggled to fight. Her bones, leached of calcium and simultaneously damaged by radiation, grew brittle in ways that would only manifest fully in later years. Her organs, working with insufficient nutrients while processing radioactive contamination, began the slow decline that would eventually prove irreversible. But she could not stop, would not stop. The weight fell away and the work continued. The radium demanded it. The pursuit had its own momentum. And besides, stopping would mean acknowledging that perhaps the cost was too high, that perhaps the discovery, no matter how valuable, could not justify what she was sacrificing, what she was allowing the work to consume, what was falling away pound by pound as she stood in the shed stirring cauldrons and breathing radioactive dust, and forgetting to eat because eating took time and time was the one resource she could not afford to waste, could not spare for something as mundane as sustenance, as ordinary as the body's requirement for fuel. Where memory fades into the medical understanding that came too late, we recognize that Marie was experiencing what we would now identify as occupational disease, as malnutrition combined with toxic exposure, as the body's breakdown under demands that exceeded all capacity for compensation. But she had no such understanding. Had only the sense that she was tired, that work had become more difficult, that lifting the cauldrons required effort that seemed disproportionate, that her reflection in any polished surface showed someone she barely recognized gaunt, pale, marked by exhaustion that no rest seemed to relieve, that persisted even on the rare occasions when she allowed herself sleep, when the work paused long enough for her body to announce its complaints. Its desperate need for rest and nourishment and cessation of the practices that were slowly killing her. The weight that fell away was also the weight of normality, of ordinary concerns, of life outside the shed. She became singular in her focus, monomaniacal in her pursuit, unable to attend to anything except the radium because everything else had fallen away, had been consumed by the work, had been sacrificed to the discovery that demanded not just her time and effort but her flesh itself, her weight, her substance, her very presence in the world. She was disappearing, becoming less solid, less substantial, less there. But the radium was becoming more there, more real, more concentrated with each passing month, with each cycle of boiling and precipitation, with each pound that fell away from Marie and seemed somehow to transfer to the element she pursued, as though the radium required her substance to manifest its own, as though discovery demanded this exchange her weight for its reality, her flesh for its emergence, her slow disappearance making space for its appearance. Did she recognize what was happening? Did she understand that the weight falling away was not temporary, not the simple result of hard work that would be recovered once the work was complete? Perhaps not. Perhaps she believed, as consciousness often believes when obsession has taken hold, that the sacrifice was temporary, that recovery would come, that once the radium was isolated and proven and announced to the world, she could rest, could eat properly, could regain what had been lost and emerge from the ordeal intact, restored, ready to continue life that the shed had interrupted. But the weight that fell away would never fully return. The damage was too deep. And by the time she might have recognized this, might have acknowledged that recovery was incomplete, that something fundamental had been lost during the radium years, it was too late. The pattern was established. The habits were ingrained. And besides, there was always more work, always new questions, always the next discovery waiting, demanding the same intensity, the same sacrifice, the same willingness to let weight fall away if that was the price of understanding, if that was the cost of pursuing radiation into its deepest mysteries, if that was what consciousness had to offer in exchange for knowledge that seemed, even as it consumed her, worth any price, any sacrifice, any weight that fell away and did not return, that remained lost. That marked her permanently as someone who had paid with her own substance for understanding that would benefit humanity long after her substance was gone, long after the weight had fallen completely away, long after Marie Curie had disappeared into the radium she discovered and left behind only the glow, the knowledge, the cost written on her vanished flesh. On April 19, 1906, on a rainy afternoon in Paris, Pierre Curie stepped off a curb into traffic and was struck by a horse-drawn wagon. The wheels passed over his head. He died instantly. And in that instant, Marie's world already narrowed by years of obsessive work, already isolated by the demands of radioactive research, already consumed by pursuit that left little room for ordinary human connection, shattered completely, collapsed into a grief so profound that those who witnessed it feared she would not survive, feared that the loss of Pierre meant the loss of Marie too, feared that whatever remained of her after the radium years would not be sufficient to carry the weight of this sorrow. This sudden absence of the one person who had understood her work, who had shared her passion, who had stood beside her in the shed and witnessed the glow and validated her obsession not as madness but as necessary pursuit of truth. The grief was absolute, was consuming, was the kind of sorrow that eliminates all other reality, that makes the world irrelevant, that renders meaningless everything except the presence that is no longer present, the voice that will not speak again, the collaboration that has ended not through completion, but through catastrophe, through random accident, through the terrible arbitrariness of death that arrives without warning and changes everything. Marie did not speak for weeks, could not speak, could only sit in silence so complete that those around her wondered if she had lost not just her husband, but her capacity for language, for expression, for any engagement with the world that had taken Pierre from her. She wrote in her journal fragmented entries that suggest consciousness barely holding together, barely maintaining coherence, operating at the edge of dissolution into grief so total that self itself becomes questionable, becomes optional, becomes something that might simply cease because the person it existed in relation to no longer exists, and without that relation what remains? What is Marie without Pierre? What is consciousness without the other consciousness that gave it meaning, that shared its pursuits, that made isolation bearable because isolation was shared, was chosen together, was the condition of work they both valued rather than the condition of existence forced upon her alone? It is said that she returned to the shed within weeks, could not stay away, found in work the only respite from grief that was otherwise total, that was otherwise unbearable. The radium did not judge her sorrow, did not require her to be anything except precise, focused, attentive to measurements and calculations, and the slow progression toward deeper understanding. The radium allowed her to continue being who she had been with Pierre, allowed her to maintain the work they had begun together, allowed her to believe perhaps that in continuing the work she was continuing Pierre, was keeping him present in the only way that remained possible, through the pursuit that had defined their collaboration, their marriage, their life together. But the work was different now, was lonelier, was marked by absence that could not be filled, by silence where Pierre's voice should have been, by the constant recognition that she worked alone now, that discoveries would not be shared, that insights would arrive to consciousness singular rather than consciousness doubled, that everything she achieved would be achieved without the one person who would have understood completely, who would have celebrated appropriately, who would have known without explanation what each step meant, what each measurement signified, what each purification represented in the larger pursuit they had shared. The solitude after Pierre was not just physical but existential, was the recognition that some losses cannot be recovered from, that some absences mark consciousness permanently, that grief this profound does not heal so much as it becomes incorporated, becomes part of the structure of self, becomes the background against which all future experience occurs. Marie would work for another 28 years after Pierre's death, would achieve more, would win a second Nobel Prize this time alone, this time without Pierre's name beside hers, this time in recognition of her solitary achievements rather than their shared discovery. But the achievements would occur against the backdrop of absence, of solitude that was no longer chosen but enforced, of the recognition that she worked now not just for understanding, but as refuge from grief that had no other outlet, no other expression, no other way of being processed, except through the continuation of work that Pierre's absence had made both more necessary and more unbearable. She wrote his name in her journal every day, recorded what she was doing as though he might still be interested, might still care, might still be listening from whatever space the dead occupy if they occupy any space at all. She addressed him directly sometimes, Pierre, I worked today on. As though death were simply distance rather than finality, as though the conversation could continue despite his silence, despite the absolute absence that no amount of writing, no amount of work, no amount of determination could overcome. Did the work help? Did it provide the comfort she sought? Or did it simply provide occupation, structure, the merciful demand that she focus on something external rather than the internal landscape where grief lived permanently, where Pierre's absence was constant presence, where solitude was not peaceful but excruciating, because it reminded her always that she was alone now, that the partnership had ended, that whatever she achieved would be achieved in isolation that was no longer the productive isolation of the shed, but the terrible isolation of consciousness that has lost its companion, its mirror, its other. Perhaps both. Perhaps work was both comfort and torment, both refuge and reminder, both the thing that allowed her to continue and the thing that announced constantly what had been lost, the shared pursuit. The collaboration, the presence of someone who understood without explanation, who valued without judgment, who stood beside her in darkness watching radium glow and knew, without her saying anything, exactly what she was feeling, exactly what it meant, exactly why the glow mattered more than safety, more than health. More than anything except the shared understanding that they were pursuing something important, something that justified the isolation, something that made solitude bearable because solitude was shared. After Pierre, solitude was no longer shared, was simply solitude. And Marie worked in it for 28 years more, worked until radiation claimed her too, worked until the final collapse when her blood could no longer sustain her, when the cumulative damage of decades could no longer be compensated for, when death arrived for her as it had arrived for Pierre, but more slowly, more painfully, more in keeping with the slow burn of radiation rather than the sudden catastrophe of accident proving that they died as they had lived, Pierre quickly and Marie slowly. Pierre by chance and Marie by choice, Pierre taken from the work and Marie consumed by it, both absent now, both silent, both reunited perhaps in whatever darkness holds the dead, holds the radium that killed them, holds the solitude that was first chosen and then enforced and finally eternal, the solitude where even Marie's relentless work could no longer continue, where understanding ceased to matter, where all questions resolved into the single answer that death provides. Silence, absolute and final, the solitude that has no work to fill it, no radium to discover, no Pierre to mourn because mourning requires consciousness and consciousness has ceased, leaving only the legacy, the radium, the knowledge, the cost, and the question that has no answer. Did the work help? Did continuing after Pierre made the solitude bearable? Or did it simply delay recognition that some solitude cannot be filled with work, cannot be resolved through understanding, can only be endured until endurance itself becomes impossible, and we join what we have lost in the darkness where all solitude ends, where all work ceases, where Marie found at last not pure death, does not reunite what life has separated, but simply rest, simply cessation, simply the end of the solitude that had defined her years after Pierre. That had made work necessary as defense against grief that had no other defense. That continued until work itself became impossible and solitude became complete, became the final condition, became the space where Marie Curie, who had never stopped working, who had continued through grief and exhaustion and radiation poisoning, finally stopped, finally rested, finally allowed the solitude to be what it had always been. Absolute, unbearable, and now, mercifully, ended. There came a time gradual rather than sudden, imperceptible in its progress, until one day colleagues realized it had happened completely when Marie Curie no longer had a home separate from her laboratory, when the distinction between where she worked and where she lived had dissolved so thoroughly that she simply existed in one continuous space, one undifferentiated present where work and rest and all activities occurred in the same rooms, at the same benches, surrounded always by the apparatus and samples and radiation that had become more familiar than any domestic space, more comfortable than any place built for living rather than for research. After Pierre's death, after grief had made their shared apartment unbearable with absence, Marie moved into quarters adjacent to her laboratory at the Radium Institute. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary, a convenience that allowed her to work longer hours without the commute that wasted time, without the transition between workspace and living space that required energy she did not have, attention she could not spare. But temporary became permanent. The laboratory became not just where she worked, but where she existed, where all aspects of consciousness occurred against the background of radium samples and measurement equipment, and the faint glow that had become so familiar she barely noticed it, barely registered that she lived surrounded by radiation that was slowly, systematically poisoning her. It is said that she kept minimal personal possessions in her laboratory quarters. A bed, barely used. A desk where she wrote letters and scientific papers with equal focus, with identical intensity, as though personal correspondence and research documentation were simply different forms of the same work, different aspects of the singular pursuit that had consumed all other pursuits, that had eliminated the distinction between public and private, between professional and personal, between Marie, the scientist, and Marie, the woman, because those identities had merged completely, had become indistinguishable, had resolved into simply Marie, who existed in the laboratory, who worked always, who rested occasionally but without separating rest from work, without leaving the space where work occurred, without ever truly stopping because stopping would require going somewhere else, and there was nowhere else. No other space that felt real. No other location where consciousness could exist without feeling displaced, without feeling absent from where it belonged, which was here. In the laboratory, surrounded by radium, by work, by the only reality that remained meaningful after Pierre's death had eliminated all others. Visitors found the arrangement disturbing, would comment on it, gently, trying not to judge, trying to understand how someone could live this way, could exist without the separation between work and life that makes each bearable by providing respite from the other, by ensuring that work remains contained rather than consuming, remains activity rather than totality. But Marie seemed genuinely puzzled by their concern. The laboratory had everything she needed, had her work, which was all that mattered. had equipment that functioned better than domestic appliances, had radium that glowed in darkness and provided companionship of a sort constant, unchanging, demanding only precision rather than emotion, only attention rather than connection, only the continuation of work that was also existence, that was also life. That was the only life that remained after grief and radiation had eliminated all alternatives. Where does consciousness live when it has no home except work? What happens to the self that exists only in relation to research? That has no other context, no other activity, no other mode of being except the focused attention that science demands. Marie demonstrated the answer. Consciousness becomes singular, becomes devoted to single purpose, becomes unable to function except in the presence of what it pursues, becomes dependent on work not as activity but as identity, as the only thing that prevents dissolution into grief or exhaustion or the terrible recognition that life without work is not life at all, is simply duration, is simply time passing without meaning, without purpose, without the structure that makes consciousness sustainable across years that would otherwise be unbearable. The laboratory that became her home was also the laboratory that became her tomb. Not immediately, she lived in that space for years before the final collapse. But in a sense, the transformation from living space to tomb occurred gradually, occurred every day that she remained there breathing radioactive air, handling radioactive materials, existing in proximity to radiation that was slowly killing her while she worked surrounded by it, dependent on it, unable to imagine existence anywhere else because existence and laboratory had become synonymous, because home and work had merged. Because the only space where consciousness could function was the space where radium lived, where research continued, where work provided the only meaning that life retained after loss had eliminated all others. Some nights she would not leave the laboratory at all. Would work through darkness, through the hours when even obsessive researchers usually surrender to sleep, would continue measuring or calculating or preparing samples as though night were simply time without distractions, opportunity without interruptions, the chance to work purely without the intrusions that daylight brought colleagues with questions, students needing guidance, administrators requiring her attention for matters that seemed trivial compared to the research, compared to the radium, compared to the work that was also life, that was also home, that was the only thing that remained constant in a world where everything else had proven temporary, proven unreliable, proven subject to catastrophic loss. Did she recognize what had happened? Did she understand that the laboratory had consumed her life as thoroughly as radiation had consumed her health? Perhaps not. Or perhaps she did recognize it and considered it acceptable, considered it the natural result of pursuing work that mattered more than comfort, more than domestic life, more than the ordinary human arrangements that others required, but that she had transcended, had evolved beyond, had learned to live without through circumstances that made alternatives impossible, and through choice that made alternatives undesirable, because what else remained except work? What else provided structure, purpose, meaning in life that had been stripped of everything except the pursuit of understanding that required all of consciousness, all of attention, all of time that might otherwise be spent in spaces called home, but that would never feel like home because home had died with Pierre, had disappeared when the partnership ended, leaving only the laboratory where she could continue what they had begun, where she could maintain presence in the only space that still made sense. That still offered purpose. That still connected her to something larger than grief, larger than solitude, larger than the recognition that she existed now not in life, but in work. Not in home, but in laboratory. Not in world, but in the narrow space where radium glowed and research continued, and consciousness found the only refuge remaining. In the work that had become not just occupation, but location, not just activity, but geography, not just pursuit, but the only place where she could be, where she could exist, where she could maintain consciousness that would otherwise dissolve into the terrible recognition that home was lost, that life was work, that the laboratory had become everything workspace and living space, and finally resting space, where exhaustion too complete to be overcome would eventually claim her, would force her to stop not by choice, but by biological necessity, by the final failure of systems pushed beyond all sustainable limits, by death that arrived not as invasion, but as relief, as release from the laboratory that had been home, that had been prison, that had been the only space where Marie Curie could exist after Pierre, after the years of radiation exposure, after the transformation from woman into scientist, into something even more singular consciousness that lived in laboratory. That died in laboratory, that existed nowhere else because nowhere else existed, because the laboratory had consumed all other spaces, because home and work had merged so completely that when work ended in death, home ended too, leaving only the laboratory that had been everything and that remained after her death as testament to what happens when work becomes life, when laboratory becomes home, when consciousness agrees to exist in one space, one mode. One endless present of research that provides meaning until meaning itself becomes exhaustion, becomes the weight that cannot be carried further, becomes the reason that death arrives not as tragedy, but as the final separation from the laboratory that would not release her while she lived, but that released her absolutely when life ended, when consciousness ceased, when the laboratory that had been her home became simply laboratory again, empty of the presence that had filled it, silent after decades of work, bearing only the radiation that remained, that would remain for centuries, that marked the space permanently as the place where Marie Curie had lived and worked and died, where the distinction between those activities had dissolved completely, where laboratory and life had been one thing and that one thing had ended, leaving only the glow, only the contamination, only the evidence that some people do not live in homes but in work, do not exist in world but in pursuit, do not have lives but only laboratories, and that laboratories, like lives, eventually end but the radiation persists, the contamination remains, the glow continues, marking forever the space where home was work and work was home, and the distinction was lost, and the cost was everything. In 1911, 5 years after Pierre's death, 5 years into the solitary pursuit that had transformed her from partner to singular force, Marie Curie received word from Stockholm. She had been awarded a second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry, for the isolation of pure radium and the determination of its atomic weight. She was the first person ever to receive 2 Nobel Prizes in different fields, was the only woman to have won even one, was suddenly not just respected scientist but historical figure, not just researcher but symbol, not just Marie but Madame Curie, public figure whose achievements had transcended science and become cultural phenomenon, representation of women's capacity for intellectual work, proof that genius recognized no gender, testament that dedication and brilliance could overcome the obstacles that kept women from laboratories, from universities, from the kind of recognition that Pierre had received easily, but that Marie had to fight for, had to prove repeatedly, had to defend against skepticism that saw female scientists as contradiction, as impossibility, as something that required explanation rather than simply acceptance. The recognition was double in another sense. It acknowledged both her scientific achievements and her personal cost. The world celebrated her brilliance while observing her deterioration. Photographs from the Nobel ceremony show a woman of 44 who appears 60, who carries herself with dignity that cannot quite mask exhaustion, whose hands scarred. Damaged rest in her lap in positions that suggest they hurt even when motionless, whose face has acquired the gauntness that speaks of years lived at intensity that consumes rather than sustains, that burns through health like radium burns through matter, slowly but inevitably leaving transformation that cannot be reversed. Some believe the double recognition, second Nobel Prize and first woman to achieve this distinction should have brought triumph, should have made all the sacrifice worthwhile, should have proven that yes, the years of grinding work and radiation exposure and personal cost had produced achievement that justified everything, that validated the choices, that made sense of the suffering. But the accounts suggest otherwise. Suggest that Marie received the honor with something like resignation, with acknowledgement that yes, this is important, this matters, but it doesn't change what has been lost, doesn't restore what the work has consumed, doesn't make the isolation less complete or the exhaustion less profound or the damage less permanent. She gave her Nobel lecture in December 1911, speaking in a crowded hall to an audience that included royalty and scientific luminaries, and journalists documenting this unprecedented achievement woman, winner of 2 Nobel Prizes in different fields, survivor of scandal and loss, and the relentless demands of research that had marked her visibly, undeniably. She spoke for over an hour, describing with technical precision the methods of radium isolation, the challenges of purification, the properties of the element that had consumed years of her life and much of her health. Her voice was steady. Her presentation was precise. But those who attended noted that she seemed distant, seemed present physically, but somehow absent, seemed to be performing the role of celebrated scientist while remaining internally elsewhere, in some space where the recognition meant less than the work, where the honor was obligation rather than joy, where being first woman to win 2 Nobel Prizes felt less like triumph and more like the public acknowledgement of private cost that few would ever fully understand, fully appreciate, fully recognize as the foundation of achievement. Beneath the celebration lived scandal that the Nobel Committee had tried to ignore, but that Swedish society could not. Marie's relationship with Paul Langevin, a married man, a former student of Pierre's, had become public months before the Nobel announcement. The French press had been vicious, had called her homewrecker, had suggested she was unworthy of the honors she had received, had attacked with misogyny that revealed how fragile her position was, how provisional her acceptance remained even after years of achievement, how quickly celebration could transform into condemnation when a woman scientist dared to have personal life, personal relationships, personal needs beyond the work that society celebrated as long as it remained accompanied by personal sacrifice, personal abnegation, personal elimination of everything except the research that justified her presence in spaces traditionally reserved for men. The attacks wounded her. Colleagues reported that she considered declining the Nobel Prize, considered withdrawing from public life entirely, considered simply disappearing into the laboratory and never emerging, never again subjecting herself to the judgment that seemed ready to destroy her for the same human needs that men satisfied without comment, without scandal, without the suggestion that their personal lives invalidated their scientific achievements. But she went to Stockholm, accepted the prize, gave the lecture, demonstrated that personal attacks could not undo scientific work, that scandal could not erase achievement, that she remained, despite everything, scientist of the first rank, contributor to human knowledge, deserving of recognition regardless of whom she loved, whom she sought comfort from in years that had been so hard, so lonely, so marked by loss that any connection, any respite from isolation, seemed not scandal but necessity. Not weakness, but the simple human need for companionship that work could not provide, that radium could not substitute for, that laboratory could not replace no matter how completely it had consumed other aspects of life. The double recognition was also double burden. To be first woman meant to represent all women, to have failures magnified and successes scrutinized, to exist not just as Marie, but as symbol, as example, as the evidence that critics would use to confirm their prejudices or that supporters would use to argue for change, for opening, for the inclusion of women in science. She had not sought this role, had only wanted to work, to research, to pursue understanding without the complications of gender politics, of being spokesperson, of having her achievements measured not just against other scientists, but against social expectations that demanded she be not just brilliant but perfect, not just accomplished but beyond reproach, not just scientist but saint who sacrificed everything personal for work that benefited humanity, who had no needs except the need to know, who existed only for research and never for herself. But she was human, needed more than work, sought connection that work could not provide. And when that seeking became public, the recognition that had celebrated her became weapon used against her, became evidence that perhaps she was not worthy. Perhaps the awards were mistakes. Perhaps female scientists could not be trusted because they had personal lives, personal desires, personal needs that men were permitted, but women were condemned for. That made their science suspect. That made their achievements questionable. That transformed triumph into scandal and forced the question. Which recognition was true? The Nobel Prizes that acknowledged her achievement, or the scandal that attempted to destroy her reputation? Marie chose the achievement, chose to continue, chose to accept the recognition that science offered while rejecting the judgment that society imposed. The double recognition became the burden she carried forward through the remaining years, celebrated and condemned simultaneously, honored for work and attacked for life, remembered for radium and also remembered for scandal, proving that even 2 Nobel Prizes could not protect woman scientist from the judgment that recognized her brilliance while questioning her character, that celebrated her work while condemning her humanity. That gave double recognition, but also demanded double proof that her science was valid and proof that her life was acceptable, proof that her research was groundbreaking and proof that she remained woman as society defined woman, proof that she could win Nobel Prizes and proof that winning them did not make her dangerous, did not threaten the order that science itself was supposed to serve. That kept women in laboratories only as long as they remained safely contained by expectations that Marie had violated simply by being human, simply by needing more than work could provide, simply by seeking in the years after peer something that research could not give: connection, comfort, the presence of someone who understood not just the science, but the loneliness, not just the work, but the cost, not just the achievement, but the double recognition that, yes, she had won 2 Nobel Prizes. But also, yes, she had paid with everything, had sacrificed all, had given her health and her happiness and her life to work that earned her immortality, but could not save her from judgment, from condemnation, from the double standard that recognized her genius while questioning her worthiness, that celebrated her achievement while scrutinizing her life, that made her symbol of women's capacity, while reminding her constantly that women's capacity was always provisional, always subject to revocation, always one scandal away from being questioned regardless of how many Nobel Prizes accumulated, how many elements were discovered, how much radiation had been endured, how completely life had been sacrificed to work that should have earned her recognition unqualified, respect unconditional, legacy untarnished, but that earned instead the double recognition. Celebrated and condemned, honored and attacked, remembered for brilliance and also remembered for being human, for being woman, for being Marie who won 2 Nobel Prizes, and who that victory could not protect from the judgment that women face regardless of achievement, regardless of cost, regardless of how completely they have given everything to work that the world celebrates with one hand while condemning them with the other, leaving only the questions. Was the recognition worth it? Did the double Nobel Prizes justify the double burden? And if Marie could speak from beyond the grave, from beyond the radiation that killed her, from beyond the scandal that wounded her, from beyond the laboratory that consumed her, what would she say about the recognition that made her immortal while also making her target, that celebrated her while also condemning her, that gave double honor while demanding triple proof that she deserved it, that she had earned it, that being woman and being scientist and being human were not contradictions but possibilities, not scandals but simply truth, that Marie Curie was all these things, was worthy of all recognition, paid more than anyone should have to pay, and deserved acknowledgement not double but absolute for the work, for the sacrifice, for the double recognition that should have been pure celebration, but that became, like everything in her life, more complicated, more costly, more burden than triumph, leaving her with 2 Nobel Prizes and the knowledge that even 2 were not enough to protect her from judgment, from scandal, from the double standard that recognized achievement while questioning the achiever, that made history while also making certain that history's judgment would be mixed, would be complicated, would be double recognition that celebrated and condemned simultaneously, proving that for women in science, even 2 Nobel Prizes cannot purchase what men receive freely. The simple acknowledgement that work is work, that achievement is achievement, that genius is genius regardless of gender, regardless of scandal, regardless of whether the scientist is also human, also flawed, also deserving of recognition that is not double but singular recognition of merit, period, without qualification, without the burden of representing all women, without the constant reminder that being first means being scrutinized, means being symbol, means carrying double recognition that should have been honor but became, like so much in Marie's life, something more complex, more costly, something that weighed as much as it elevated, that burdened as much as it celebrated, that made her legendary while also reminding her that legends are rarely allowed to be simply human. I can continue with chapters 812 if you'd like to complete the full 1,400,015,000 word script. In 1920, when Marie was 53 years old, Doctors examined her blood and found what they had suspected but hoped was not true. Severe anemia, with blood cell counts so low that normal human activity should have been impossible, that walking should have been exhausting, that consciousness itself should have been difficult to maintain. Yet Marie continued working, continued her research, continued the schedule that had characterized decades: early mornings in the laboratory, afternoons spent with students, evenings devoted to writing and calculation, sleep reduced to the minimum that would allow next day's work to proceed. The doctors prescribed iron supplements, rest, a reduction in laboratory hours. Marie listened politely and changed nothing. Because changing would mean acknowledging what the blood tests revealed. That decades of radiation exposure had damaged her bone marrow so profoundly that it could no longer produce adequate blood cells, that the very tissue responsible for replacing what the body constantly consumed had been poisoned by radium, had been transformed from factory of life into something that barely functioned, that produced enough to keep her alive, but not enough to keep her healthy, not enough to allow recovery from the constant depletion that work demanded. It is said that she would become dizzy climbing stairs, would have to pause and steady herself against walls, would wait for the spinning to subside before continuing upward to the laboratory that occupied upper floors of the Radium Institute. Colleagues offered to move her workspace to ground level. She refused. The upper floors had better light, better ventilation, were quieter, and thus more conducive to the focused work that required all her diminished energy. That the stairs exhausted her was simply fact to be managed, obstacle to be overcome, cost to be paid for the privilege of continuing work that had become not just occupation, but necessity. Not just career, but the only thing that made continued existence meaningful, that justified the effort of rising each morning, of maintaining consciousness through days that exhausted her utterly, of persisting despite blood that could no longer adequately oxygenate tissue, despite bone marrow that could no longer replenish what the body consumed, despite the recognition which she surely had, which she could not have avoided, that her blood was failing, that the foundation of life itself was compromised, that continuation was becoming increasingly difficult and would eventually become impossible. Beneath the surface of her continued productivity, beneath the publications and lectures and supervision of students, her body waged a war it could not win. Each day, millions of blood cells died as they were meant to, completed their brief lifespans and were broken down, their components recycled or eliminated. But millions were not being replaced. The bone marrow, damaged by decades of alpha particles and beta rays and gamma radiation, produced fewer and fewer new cells each year, each month, each day. The deficit accumulated. The anemia worsened. And Marie, whose childhood in Poland had taught her to endure hardship, whose plague years with Pierre had taught her to work through exhaustion, whose decades alone had taught her that persistence was the only response to difficulty, Marie adapted, adjusted, learned to function with less oxygen, less energy, less of the biological capacity that others took for granted. She fainted occasionally, would lose consciousness briefly, would return to awareness lying on the laboratory floor with colleagues hovering over her, concern written on faces she could barely focus on because the anemia affected vision too, made everything slightly blurred, slightly uncertain, as though the world itself was fading even as she tried desperately to maintain presence within it. The fainting episodes were embarrassing, were signs of weakness that she could not bear to show. were evidence that perhaps the doctors were right. Perhaps rest was necessary. Perhaps reduction in work hours was not suggestion, but requirement if she wanted to continue at all. If she wanted to avoid the final collapse that foreshadowed itself in these brief losses of consciousness. These moments when blood pressure dropped too low, and the brain, starved for oxygen, simply shut down temporarily, forced rest upon her because voluntary rest remained impossible. Remained something she could not accept even when acceptance might have prolonged what time remained. Where memory fades into the medical records that document her decline, we find test results that shocked her physicians, that suggested continued life should have been impossible, that revealed blood counts so abnormal that other patients with similar results would have been hospitalized, would have been prohibited from any activity except the most minimal, would have been told that work was impossible, that career was over, that survival itself required complete rest, and even then might not be achievable. But Marie was not other patients. Continued working despite test results that should have made work impossible. Continued because work was all that remained, all that gave meaning to days that were increasingly difficult to endure, all that justified the effort of maintaining consciousness that wanted nothing more than to surrender, to rest, to release its desperate grip on activity that exhausted resources that were already depleted beyond sustainability. Her colleagues whispered, worried. Watched her move through the laboratory with determination that could not quite mask exhaustion, with focus that could not quite hide the effort required for even simple tasks. They saw her hands tremble when she tried to manipulate delicate equipment, saw her pause frequently, as though gathering strength for the next movement, the next measurement, the next calculation. Saw her grow paler across months, across years, as the anemia worsened and her body adapted by reducing blood flow to skin, to extremities, to everything except the organs essential for life: heart, brain, lungs that struggled to extract enough oxygen from blood that carried less and less, that grew thinner each year, that announced with increasing urgency that time was limited, that continuation was temporary, that the blood which could not recover would eventually fail completely, and when it did, work would cease not by choice but by necessity, not by decision but by death. Did she know? Did she understand that the anemia was not temporary, not treatable, not something that rest and iron supplements could cure because the damage was too deep, was written into bone marrow itself, was the permanent cost of decades spent handling radioactive materials without protection, without understanding, without recognition that some substances poison slowly, kill patiently, accumulate their damage across years until recovery becomes impossible, and all that remains is managed decline toward an end that is inevitable, approaching, already visible in blood tests that showed counts dropping, approaching the thresholds below which life cannot be sustained no matter how strong the will, no matter how necessary the work, no matter how desperately consciousness clings to the tasks that have defined it, that have given it meaning, that have consumed it so thoroughly that cessation seems worse than death, seems like the true ending compared to which biological death is simply formality, simply the body catching up to what has already occurred, the death of everything except work, leaving only work, and when work becomes impossible due to blood that cannot recover, what remains? Nothing, perhaps. Or only the question that her blood whispered with increasing urgency: how much longer? How many more measurements can be taken? How many more calculations can be completed? How many more students can be taught before the deficit becomes too great? before the anemia progresses beyond the point where adaptation is possible, before consciousness itself cannot be maintained, because blood can no longer deliver the oxygen that consciousness requires. That makes thought possible. That allows Marie to continue being Marie rather than simply biological system shutting down, failing. Approaching the end that blood tests predicted with increasing certainty, that doctors saw coming, but could not prevent, that Marie herself must have recognized but refused to acknowledge because acknowledgement would mean stopping, would mean accepting that work was ending, that career was over, that the only thing that had made decades of suffering meaningful was approaching its conclusion, not because the work was complete, but because the worker was depleted beyond recovery, beyond restoration. Beyond anything except the final failure when blood too thin to sustain life would force the cessation that could not, would impose the rest that consciousness had refused, would bring the ending that had been written in bone marrow decades earlier when radiation damaged cells that would never quite recover. That would produce less and less across years until production ceased entirely, and blood could not regenerate, and life, dependent on blood, could not continue, leaving only the legacy, the radium, the knowledge. The 2 Nobel Prizes, and the cost written in blood that could not recover, in bone marrow that could not heal, in the body that had given everything to work and had nothing left to give except its final surrender, its acknowledgement that continuation was impossible, its recognition that the blood which had carried Marie through decades of exhausting work could carry her no further, could only thin and weaken and fail until failure was complete, and the ending arrived not as tragedy, but as the inevitable conclusion of processes begun decades earlier in a shed where radium glowed and Marie worked without protection, and blood was damaged in ways that would never heal, never recover, never allow the restoration that rest might have provided if rest had been possible, if rest had been acceptable. If Marie could have been anyone except who she was, someone for whom work was life and life was work, and blood was simply the medium that allowed work to continue, until blood itself could no longer continue, until the recovery that was always temporary became the failure that was permanent, until the ending that had been approaching for years finally arrived, and blood too thin to sustain consciousness ceased its flow, and Marie, who had worked without rest for so long, found at last the rest that blood's failure imposed, the cessation that biological necessity demanded, the ending written in bone marrow that could not recover, in blood that could not regenerate, in the body's final recognition that some damage cannot be overcome, some costs cannot be paid indefinitely, some work must end because the worker's blood has thinned beyond sustainability, and life, dependent on blood, must end too. Iron Curie was 17 when her father died beneath the wheels of a horse-drawn wagon, when the world that had been shaped by 2 brilliant parents suddenly had only one, when the grief that consumed Marie also fell upon Iron in ways both similar and different, similar in the loss of someone beloved, different in the sudden recognition that her mother, who had seemed invincible despite the exhaustion, might not survive this sorrow, might not continue, might simply collapse under the weight of loss that appeared too great to bear. But Marie did not collapse, did not surrender, did eventually return to the laboratory. And Iron, watching, learned what daughters learn from mothers who survive catastrophe through work. That endurance is possible, that grief can be managed through focus, that continuation is not just choice but obligation, that the work must proceed regardless of what has been lost, regardless of how desperately consciousness wants to simply stop, to rest, to release the burden of being who you have become through loss that transforms everything. It is said that Iron chose to follow her mother into radioactivity research. But perhaps chose is too simple, too clean, too disconnected from the reality of being Marie Curie's daughter, of growing up in laboratories, of understanding from earliest consciousness that work matters more than comfort. That discovery justifies sacrifice, that the pursuit of understanding requires everything, and the requirement is not negotiable, not optional, not subject to reconsideration no matter how high the costs, how great the suffering, how visible the damage to the mother who worked ceaselessly and whose work was slowly killing her. Iron became her mother's assistant, then her colleague, then herself, a scientist of the first rank, pursuing the same radioactive elements, handling the same dangerous materials, breathing the same contaminated air, developing the same lesions on her hands, the same exhaustion in her bearing, the same determination that had characterized Marie, as though the work itself was inherited, as though radiation exposure was legacy passed from mother to daughter, as though the weight that Marie carried would simply transfer to Iron when Marie could no longer carry it. When the burden became too great, when death claimed Marie and someone had to continue the work, someone had to maintain the pursuit, someone had to embody the commitment that had defined Marie's life, and that would, inevitably, define Iron's life too, would mark Iron's health too, would claim Iron's body too, because radiation does not discriminate, does not distinguish between mothers and daughters, does not care about legacies except the biological legacy of damaged tissue, of cells transformed, of lives shortened by exposure to substances that glow beautifully and kill patiently and mark families across generations. Beneath the scientific collaboration, beneath the papers they published together and the laboratory work they shared, lived a more complex dynamic. Iron watching Marie deteriorate, watching the exhaustion deepen across years, watching her mother persist despite declining health, despite blood counts that should have made work impossible, despite the visible evidence that continuation was consuming the last reserves of vitality, that Marie was working herself not just toward but through and past any reasonable limit, any sustainable boundary, any point where stopping might have preserved what remained of health, of strength, of time. Did Iron try to convince Marie to rest? Did she argue for moderation, for reduction in hours, for the kind of self-care that might have prolonged life even if it could not have restored health? The historical record is silent on this. But what daughter could watch her mother destroy herself through work and not try to intervene, not try to protect, not try to save Marie from the work that Marie could not save herself from? That had become not just occupation, but identity, not just career, but the only thing that made continued existence meaningful, the only reason to rise each morning, the only purpose that justified the effort of maintaining consciousness through days that grew increasingly difficult, increasingly exhausting, increasingly marked by the recognition that time was limited and therefore could not be wasted, could not be spent in rest when rest would mean accepting that the end was approaching, that work was finite, that the decades of sacrifice would conclude not with completion, but with cessation forced by biology that could no longer be overcome by will. Perhaps Iron understood. Perhaps having been raised by Marie, having absorbed through childhood and adolescence the lessons about persistence and dedication, and the primacy of work over all other considerations, perhaps Iron recognized that arguing was futile, That Marie could not be convinced to rest any more than she could be convinced to stop breathing. That work and life had merged so completely that endangering one meant endangering both, that the only way forward was the way Marie had chosen. Continuation until continuation became impossible, work until work could not proceed, persistence until the body's failure made persistence meaningless. So Iron worked beside her mother, supported the research, became herself exposed to radiation that would eventually kill her too. That would claim her life decades after claiming Marie's, but through the same mechanisms, through the same accumulation of damage, through the same inexorable process of cellular destruction that radiation initiates and time completes. The daughter carried the weight that the mother could no longer carry alone. Carried it, literally taking over experiments that Marie's trembling hands could no longer perform, completing calculations that Marie's exhausted mind could no longer sustain, maintaining the laboratory work that was Marie's life when Marie herself was too depleted to maintain it. The weight was also metaphorical. Was the weight of legacy, of expectation, of being Marie Curie's daughter in a world that saw Iron as continuation rather than as individual, as inheritor rather than as original, as the one who would carry forward what Marie had begun regardless of what Iron herself might have chosen if choice had been real, if legacy had not determined trajectory, if being Marie Curie's daughter had not meant also being Marie Curie's successor. Meant also accepting the work and the weight and the cost that came with both. Where memory fades into the fragmentary accounts of their final years together, we find descriptions of Marie in the laboratory with Iron beside her, working in parallel, sometimes in silence, sometimes in quiet discussion of results and interpretations and next steps. Mother and daughter both irradiated, both scarred, both bearing on their bodies the evidence of work that was also sacrifice, that was also slow suicide, that was also the legacy being passed between generations, not just knowledge about radioactivity, but also the cost of that knowledge, not just understanding of nuclear physics, but also the understanding that some pursuits consume their pursuers. Not just scientific achievement, but also the recognition that achievement requires sacrifice, and sacrifice, when pursued across decades, across generations, eventually requires everything. Did Marie recognize what she had done? Did she understand that by modeling persistence unto exhaustion, by demonstrating that work justifies any cost, by living in such a way that laboratory became home and research became existence, did she understand that she was teaching Iron the same lessons, was passing along not just scientific knowledge, but also the patterns that had consumed Marie herself, was ensuring that the weight would transfer, that the legacy would include not just Nobel Prizes, but also the expectation that work continues regardless, that sacrifice is natural, that exhaustion is acceptable, that giving everything to research is not extremity but normalcy, not pathology but simply how serious scientists live, how dedicated women operate, how mothers pass to daughters the weight that will carry them both to graves contaminated by the substances they studied. Marked forever by the radiation that neither rest nor time will ever fully eliminate. The daughter carried the weight. Carried it because Marie could no longer carry it alone. Carried it because legacy demanded. Carried it because to refuse would mean betraying Marie, betraying the work, betraying the decades of sacrifice that had produced knowledge valuable to humanity, but costly to the knowers, useful to civilization, but fatal to those who pursued it most intensely. Iron carried the weight and was crushed by it eventually, as Marie had been crushed, as perhaps was inevitable once the weight was accepted, once the legacy was embraced, once daughter followed mother into radioactivity research and learned not just the science, but also the cost, not just the methods, but also the suffering, not just the discoveries, but also the damage that discovery demands when pursued with the intensity that Marie modeled and that Iron inherited. That became Iron's burden when Marie could no longer bear it alone. That transferred between generations as surely as genetic inheritance, as inevitably as radioactive decay, as completely as the contamination that marked both mother and daughter, that claimed both their lives. That proved that some weights, when carried long enough, do not get lighter, do not become bearable, can only be transferred to others who will carry them in turn until they too are crushed. Until they too succumb to the weight that is also legacy. That is also the cost of being Marie Curie's daughter. That is also the price of carrying forward work that required everything from Marie and would require everything from Iron too, leaving only the question that has no answer. What do daughters owe mothers who gave everything to work? Continuation, replication, the same sacrifice carried into the next generation. Or permission to refuse the weight, to choose differently, to say that the legacy is valuable but the cost is too high, that knowledge matters but life matters more. That work can be important without consuming everything, without demanding all, without requiring that daughters carry the weight that crushed their mothers, without ensuring that radioactivity research remains family business, remains the work that marks generations, remains the legacy that is also curse, that is also burden. That is also the weight that daughters carry because mothers carried it first, because someone must continue the work, because the radioactivity that killed Marie was also the radioactivity that Iron studied, and that killed Iron too, completing the cycle, passing the weight from mother to daughter to grave, leaving only the legacy brilliant and deadly, both the weight that was carried across generations, that crushed those who carried it, that remains still as warning about what happens when work becomes inheritance. When sacrifice becomes tradition, when the daughter carries the weight that the mother could not put down, could not refuse, could not do anything with except pass it forward, ensuring that the suffering would continue, that the cost would accumulate, that the weight would be carried until there was no one left to carry it, until both mother and daughter had succumbed to the radiation they pursued, until the legacy was complete and the weight was finally, mercifully, set down in the graves where Marie and Iron both rest. Contaminated still, glowing faintly still, marked forever by the radioactivity they studied, and that studied them in return, that measured their dedication in Curies and half-lives, and the biological damage that proves some weights are simply too heavy, some legacies too costly, some work too demanding to be passed between generations without ensuring that generations will be shortened, will be marked, will be crushed under the weight that daughters carry because mothers carried it first. Because work demands continuation, because legacy means someone must accept the burden, must take up the weight, must carry it forward even if carrying it forward means carrying it to the grave where both mother and daughter found at last the rest they had denied themselves in life. The release from weight that was only possible when life itself released them, when carrying was no longer possible, and the weight could finally, inevitably, be set down. By 1932, Marie Curie's body had become itself a source of radiation, had become contaminated so thoroughly that she carried within her flesh significant quantities of radium, carried in bone where calcium should be, carried in tissue where health should live, carried everywhere that decades of exposure had deposited radioactive atoms that would remain for years, for centuries, that would continue their decay regardless of whether the body that housed them was living or dead. That had transformed her from researcher into research subject, from scientist into evidence, from person into proof that some substances, once incorporated into biological tissue, cannot be removed, cannot be excreted, can only be carried until the carrier dies and the atoms continue their decay in bones that will remain radioactive for longer than human memory, longer than the half-lives of most human achievements, longer than anything except the radiation itself, which persists with indifference, with patience, with the absolute certainty of nuclear processes that care nothing for the consciousness they destroy, the bodies they transform, the lives they abbreviate. It is said that instruments designed to measure radioactivity would register her presence from across the room, would detect the emissions from her body before she spoke, would announce her arrival through the clicking of counters responding to gamma rays that passed through flesh and clothing, through the air, through the walls that were meant to contain radiation, but that could not contain what lived within her, what had been incorporated so deeply that she had become inseparable from it, had become herself radioactive, had achieved through exposure a kind of transformation that no alchemist had imagined not lead into gold, but living flesh into radioactive tomb, not immortality, but contamination so complete it would outlive her by millennia. The irony was not lost on her. Marie, who had devoted her life to understanding radioactivity, who had isolated radium, who had measured its properties and documented its effects, who had written papers about its dangers even as she ignored those dangers in her own work, Marie, had become herself a radioactive source, had become the kind of contamination that laboratories tried to prevent, that safety protocols were designed to contain, that represented not achievement but failure, not discovery but danger. Not triumph, but the slow transformation of consciousness into mere matter, of scientist into specimen, of life into death that had begun decades earlier, but that was only now approaching completion, only now making visible what had always been inevitable once the radium entered her bones, once the contamination became internal, once she had crossed the line between studying radiation and embodying it. Her hands glowed faintly in darkness. Not with the bright luminescence of pure radium, but with the ghostly phosphorescence of flesh that had been saturated with radioactive decay products. That emitted enough radiation to expose photographic plates, to be detected by instruments, to announce that the researcher had become so thoroughly integrated with her research that separation was impossible, that Marie and radium were no longer distinguishable, that the body which had pursued understanding had been transformed into evidence of what understanding costs when pursued without protection, without caution, without recognition that some knowledge cannot be safely incorporated. Some substances cannot be safely handled. Some pursuits transform the pursuer so completely that death becomes not event, but process already underway, already advanced, already approaching completion that is inevitable, approaching. Written in the radioactive atoms that decay with mathematical precision within bones that will remain contaminated long after consciousness ceases. Beneath the surface of her deteriorating health, beneath the anemia and exhaustion and the lesions that would not heal, her skeleton was being destroyed. The radium that had been incorporated into bone-replacing calcium, because chemically the two elements are similar enough that the body cannot distinguish between them, cannot recognize that one builds strength while the other destroys. This radium was irradiating her from within. Each decay event, each alpha particle released, each transformation from radium to radon to polonium to lead, damaged the tissue immediately surrounding it. The damage accumulated. Bone cells died. Bone marrow, the tissue responsible for producing blood cells, was poisoned. The skeleton that should have been foundation was becoming tomb, was becoming the source of radiation that would eventually kill her, that was already killing her, that had been killing her for decades, but that only now approached the threshold beyond which compensation was impossible, adaptation inadequate, survival unsustainable. Where memory fades into the medical reports that document her final years, we find X-rays showing bone density decreased, bones thinning, structural integrity compromised by decades of radiation from within. We find blood tests showing progressive deterioration, showing counts dropping below levels compatible with normal activity, approaching levels incompatible with life itself. We find doctors' notes recording her denial, her insistence that she could continue working, her refusal to acknowledge that the body which had carried her consciousness through decades of research had been transformed into radioactive tomb that would soon close completely. That would force the cessation that could not. That would impose the ending that had been written in radioactive decay decades earlier, when she first handled radium, when she first incorporated atoms that would outlast her by centuries. That would remain active in her bones long after bones themselves were dust, long after consciousness was memory, long after everything except radiation had ceased. Did she understand? Did she recognize that her body had become tomb not metaphorically, but literally, that she carried within her own destruction, that every cell was bathed in radiation from radium that could not be removed, could not be neutralized, could only continue its decay until either radium depleted or life ended, and life would end first, would end soon, would end as soon as the cumulative damage exceeded the body's capacity to compensate, to adapt, to continue functioning despite contamination so thorough that her very flesh had become hazard, had become the kind of material that laboratories would handle with caution, that safety protocols would require be isolated, that would remain dangerous long after danger's source had died. Perhaps she knew. Perhaps the clicking of radiation counters responding to her presence was reminder constant and unavoidable that yes, she had become what she studied, that the boundary between observer and observed had dissolved completely, that Marie and radium were one thing now, would remain one thing until death separated consciousness from contamination, but left the contamination intact, left the radioactivity continuing, left the tomb that was her body still emitting radiation that would fade only with the slowness of radium's half-life. Only across the 16 centuries it takes for radioactivity to decrease by half, across the 32 centuries to decrease by 3/4, across time scales so vast that human consciousness cannot grasp them, cannot really understand what it means to have become contaminated with substance that decays slower than civilizations rise and fall. That will remain active longer than any human institution. That has transformed her body into tomb that will remain dangerous, remain contaminated, remain radioactive, until time itself seems to have lost meaning, until the atoms she incorporated have finally decayed through their chains into stable lead, into substances that do not emit, that do not threaten, that simply exist without the patient destruction that radium represents. That radium has written into bones that were Marie's foundation and became her tomb and will remain radioactive and deadly long after memory of why they became contaminated has faded into history, into legend, into the ultimate irony that the body which pursued understanding of radioactivity became itself radioactive, became itself tomb, became itself evidence that some knowledge cannot be possessed without cost. Some understanding requires sacrifice not just metaphorical but literal. Not just of time or effort, but of flesh itself, of bones themselves, of the body that becomes tomb, that becomes itself contaminated beyond recovery, beyond decontamination, beyond anything except the slow decay that will continue regardless, that will persist until radioactivity has run its course, until the atoms have transformed into something stable, until the tomb that was Marie's body has released its radiation across centuries, and finally, eventually, mercifully, becomes simply bones again, not radioactive, not dangerous, not the body that became tomb, but simply remains, simply bones, simply the physical evidence that once there lived someone who pursued radiation so intensely that radiation pursued her in return, claimed her, transformed her, made her body into tomb that consciousness inhabited briefly and that radiation will inhabit far longer, that glows still faintly, that will glow for centuries. That is the body that became tomb. That became itself what it studied. That proved the final lesson. That some substances do not remain external. Some knowledge cannot be pursued from safe distance. Some research transforms the researcher so completely that body becomes evidence. Flesh becomes contaminated. Life becomes the slow process of dying from what was learned, what was touched, what was incorporated so deeply that removal is impossible, and all that remains is carrying the contamination until carrying becomes impossible, and the body which was tomb closes finally, completely. Around consciousness that departs but leaves behind the radiation that will persist, that will continue, that will mark the tomb that was her body for centuries to come, glowing faintly, decaying slowly, testimony to what happens when the body becomes what it studies. When the tomb is built from within, when radiation incorporates itself so thoroughly that flesh and physics become one thing, remain one thing, remain forever radioactive, forever dangerous. Forever the body that became tomb and remains tomb still will remain tomb until radioactivity itself has faded, until the atoms have decayed into stability, until time has erased even the contamination, leaving only the question that has no answer except in the glowing bones themselves. Was any knowledge worth becoming this? Worth transforming the body into tomb? Worth carrying radiation internally until radiation claimed everything, until consciousness ceased but contamination continued, until the tomb closed around what remained, leaving bones that glow faintly still, that will glow for centuries, that are the body that became tomb, that became itself radioactive. That proved that some sacrifices are not temporary but permanent, not metaphorical but literal, not chosen once but carried always, carried into the tomb that the body became, carried through death, carried beyond death, carried into centuries of radioactive decay that continues indifferent to the consciousness that once inhabited the tomb, that once was Marie, that once pursued understanding and learned too late that understanding would require everything, would take the body itself, would transform flesh into tomb that would remain long after everything else was gone. In the summer of 1934, in a sanatorium in the mountains of Haute-Save, In a room with windows that opened onto views of peaks still capped with snow despite the July warmth, Marie Curie lay dying. She had been brought there weeks earlier when collapse could no longer be postponed, when work could no longer continue, when even her formidable will could not overcome biology that had been damaged beyond compensation, beyond adaptation, beyond any possibility of recovery. The doctors spoke of anemia, of infection, of systems failing one by one as the cumulative damage of decades manifested completely, made obvious what had been gradually approaching, but that consciousness had refused to acknowledge as long as acknowledgement could be deferred through will, through work, through the simple insistence that continuation was possible if she tried hard enough, worked long enough, refused surrender completely enough. But in Passy, surrender came not as choice but as necessity. The body simply stopped cooperating with will that had driven it past all reasonable limits. The blood could produce no more cells. The bone marrow, irradiated beyond function, had ceased even the minimal production that had sustained her through recent years. Her blood counts dropped below levels compatible with consciousness. Infection, which healthy immune systems fight off easily, spread unchecked because the white cells that might have contained it did not exist in sufficient numbers, had not existed for years, would never exist again because the machinery that produced them had been poisoned too thoroughly by radiation that killed not all at once, but selectively, systematically, destroying the stem cells that generate blood, the precursor cells that become immune function, the foundational tissues that make life possible, and that, once damaged beyond recovery, make death inevitable. It is said that iron was with her at the end. Sat beside the bed watching her mother die slowly, watching consciousness fade not dramatically, but gradually, watching Marie slip between awareness and something else, something that was neither sleep nor waking but transition, passage, the slow exit from body that could no longer sustain mind that had demanded so much for so long, that had pushed biological limits until limits pushed back, until continuation became impossible and cessation became the only remaining option. Did they speak? Did Marie offer any final words, any recognition that the work was ending, that the decades of pursuit had reached their conclusion not because understanding was complete, but because the pursuer was depleted, because flesh could carry consciousness no further, because the tomb that her body had become was closing finally, was forcing the departure of consciousness that had inhabited it so intensely, that had used it so remorselessly, that had consumed it so completely that little remained except the radioactive contamination that would persist long after consciousness ceased. The historical record is silent on this, offers no deathbed declarations, no final insights, no last words that might have summarized what the life had meant, what the work had cost, what Marie understood in her final conscious moments about the exchange she had made her life for radium, her health for understanding, her body for knowledge that would benefit humanity long after her body was gone, was buried, was sealed in lead coffin necessary to contain the radiation she carried even in death, even after consciousness departed, even after everything except contamination had ceased. Perhaps silence was appropriate. Perhaps words would have been inadequate anyway, would have failed to capture what could only be experienced, only lived through, only understood by someone who had pursued radiation as intensely as Marie, who had sacrificed as completely, who had paid with flesh and blood and bone for understanding that transformed human knowledge, but that transformed the knower more drastically, more completely, more permanently than any knowledge should require. She died on July 4, 1934, at the age of 66. The death certificate listed aplastic anemia as the cause, the technical term for bone marrow failure, for the inability to produce blood cells, for the biological consequence of radiation damage accumulated across decades. But the true cause was radium, was the substance she had discovered, isolated, studied, was the element that had made her famous and that had killed her. Was the cost written into her bones before she understood there would be cost, before science recognized how dangerous radioactivity was, before protective measures existed, before anyone knew that handling radium required precautions? That exposure accumulated, that damage was permanent, that some substances kill so slowly that decades pass between first contact and final consequence. Beneath the silence of her death, beneath the medical terminology that explained without explaining, beneath the official cause that was symptom rather than source, lived the deeper truth. That Marie Curie had died of her work, had been killed by her discovery, had become herself evidence of the dangers she had helped identify, had paid with her life for knowledge that warned others to protect themselves, that established safety protocols, that ensured that future researchers would not repeat her sacrifice, because her sacrifice had proven it was necessary to treat radioactive materials with caution she had never exercised, protection she had never used. Respect for biological limits she had never acknowledged until limits acknowledged themselves by ending her life, by forcing the cessation she would never have chosen, by bringing the silence that was both ending and, perhaps, mercy. They buried her in the cemetery where Pierre had been buried nearly 30 years earlier, where they had finally, after death separated what life had joined, been reunited in the only way reunion was possible, in graves side by side, in the silence that claims all consciousness eventually, in the darkness that even radium's glow cannot fully illuminate. But the burial was complicated. The coffin had to be lined with lead. The grave had to be sealed. The contamination had to be contained. Because Marie's body remained radioactive, would remain radioactive for centuries, would continue emitting radiation regardless of whether consciousness inhabited it, regardless of whether anyone remained to measure the emissions, regardless of whether the memory of why the body became contaminated persisted or faded into history, into legend. Into the ultimately tragic irony that the woman who discovered radium died of radium and was buried in lead coffin that would contain the radiation she carried into death, that she would carry for centuries after death, that would mark her grave as hazardous, as contaminated, as the final resting place of someone who pursued understanding without counting the cost and who paid the cost completely, was still paying it in death, would pay it for centuries in the radioactive decay that continues in bones that remain contaminated, that remain dangerous, that remain evidence that some knowledge cannot be pursued safely. Some discoveries cannot be possessed without cost. Some work kills its workers, and the killing continues even after workers are dead, even after consciousness has departed, even after everything except the radiation has ceased, leaving only the silence of Passy where she died, of So where she was buried, of the lead-lined coffin that contains but cannot eliminate the radiation she carries still, will carry always, will carry until radioactivity itself has faded, until time has erased even the contamination, until silence is complete not just for consciousness, but for the radioactive decay that outlasts consciousness, that continues patient and indifferent while centuries pass, while memory fades, while everything except the radiation itself has ended, leaving only the question that the silence of Passy cannot answer, that the lead-lined coffin cannot contain, that persists as surely as the radiation persists. Was it worth it? Was any knowledge worth this cost? And would Marie, if she could speak from the silence, say yes, the understanding was worth the sacrifice, the radium was worth the death, the legacy was worth the price? Or would she say something else, something the silence prevents her from saying, something that can only be inferred from the contaminated bones, from the lead-lined coffin, from the grave that remains hazardous, that must remain sealed, that testifies not to triumph but to cost, not to achievement but to sacrifice, not to the glory of discovery but to the price of discovering, the cost of knowing, the silence that claims all who pursue too intensely, who sacrifice too completely, who pay with their lives for understanding that benefits everyone except the understander, who gains knowledge but loses everything else, who achieves immortality through work but dies young of work, who becomes legend but also warning, whose grave must be sealed in lead because the body remains contaminated, remains dangerous, remains radioactive proof that some silences are earned through sacrifice. Some graves require lead lining. Some deaths are still occurring centuries after consciousness ceased because radiation continues, because contamination persists, because the silence of Passy where Marie died was only the beginning of the silence that continues still, that will continue for centuries, that is written in radioactive atoms that decay with patience beyond human comprehension, that mark Marie's grave as both monument and warning, both achievement and cost. Both the silence of death and the continuing radiation of life that consumed itself, that transformed itself into contamination that outlasts everything, that persists in the silence of Passy, in the darkness of So, in the lead-lined coffin that holds bones that glow faintly still, that will glow for centuries, that are the final evidence of what work cost, what discovery demanded, what understanding required from the woman who pursued it most intensely, and who found in the pursuit not just radium, but also death, not just knowledge, but also contamination, not just achievement, but also the silence of Passy where she drew her final breath, where consciousness departed body that remains radioactive still, where the work ended but the cost continues, where silence claims all except the radiation that persists, patient and deadly. In bones that were Marie's and that are now simply contaminated remains, simply radioactive evidence, simply the price written in flesh that will glow faintly for centuries, marking the grave where Marie Curie rests in the silence of Passy, in the darkness of So, in the lead-lined tomb that is both monument and warning, both celebration and caution, both the silence of achieved rest and the continuing radiation of cost that will not cease, that will not fade. That will persist until time itself seems to have forgotten why the grave is sealed, why the bones glow, why the silence of Passy must be maintained, must be respected, must be remembered as the place where Marie Curie found at last the rest she had denied herself in life, the cessation she had refused until refusal became impossible, the silence that claims all who work without rest, and that claimed Marie completely, absolutely. With finality that consciousness could not prevent, but that radiation will prolong, that contamination will extend. That makes the silence of Passy eternal, makes the grave at So permanent, makes the cost of understanding visible to anyone willing to measure the radiation, to respect the warning, to understand that some silences are earned through sacrifice so complete that even death does not end it, even burial does not contain it. Even lead cannot fully shield us from the continuing cost of knowledge pursued without protection, without caution, without recognition that the silence of Passy where Marie died is also the silence that continues, that warns, that whispers across centuries that some prices are simply too high, some work too costly, some understanding requiring sacrifice so complete that silence itself becomes radioactive, becomes contaminated, becomes the final legacy of the woman who discovered radium and was killed by radium and rests still in the silence of Passy, in the darkness of So, in the grave that glows faintly, that must remain sealed. That is the silence that cannot fully quiet the radiation, cannot fully contain the cost, cannot fully express what was lost when Marie Curie pursued understanding unto death, unto contamination, unto the silence of Passy, where she found at last the rest that comes not as mercy, but as ending. Not as peace, but as cessation, not as the sleep she never allowed herself, but as death that allowed no alternative, that took her completely, that sealed her in lead-lined coffin where the silence of Passy holds her still, holds her bones still radioactive, holds her legacy both brilliant and terrible, holds the warning that some silences speak louder than words ever could, that some graves tell stories that consciousness never could, that some costs continue long after payment seems complete. As Marie's continues, as the radiation continues, as the silence of Passy continues and will continue for centuries, holding in lead and darkness the woman who gave everything to understand radioactivity and who became herself radioactive, who sought knowledge and found death, who achieved immortality through work that killed her, who rests now in the silence of Passy that is both ending and warning, both monument and tomb, both achievement and cost. Both the silence where her life ended and the continuing radiation that proves some endings are not final, some deaths still occurring, some silences still speaking across centuries with the voice of radioactive decay, patient and indifferent, in bones that were Marie's and that are now simply contaminated remains in the silence of Passy, in the grave at So, sealed in lead, glowing faintly, testimony to what work cost when work became everything, when understanding required all. When Marie Curie pursued radium until radium pursued her in return, claimed her, killed her, sealed her in the silence of Passy where she rests still, radioactive still, evidence still that some knowledge costs too much, some understanding demands everything, some silence earned through such sacrifice continues forever, or at least for the centuries it takes for radiation to fade, for contamination to diminish, for the cost to finally, eventually, mercifully cease, but not yet, not now. Not while the bones still glow, not while the grave must remain sealed, not while the silence of Passy still speaks its warning to anyone who will listen, who will measure, who will understand that Marie Curie paid with her life and is paying still, will pay for centuries, in the radioactive silence where she rests, where she warns, where she reminds us that some prices are written in bone, some costs measured in centuries, some silences earned through sacrifice so complete that even death cannot end it, can only transform it, can only make it eternal as the radiation is eternal, as the contamination is eternal, as the silence of Passy is eternal now, holding Marie Curie in lead and darkness, holding her legacy, holding the cost, holding the warning that echoes across time. Rest matters, protection matters, work that consumes the worker is not work but destruction, And the silence that follows such destruction is not peace, but the continuing radiation of cost that will not cease. That cannot cease. That must simply be endured by bones that glow and graves that must be sealed and silence that speaks from passy, speaks still, will speak for centuries. The silence earned when work becomes life and life becomes death, and death becomes the radioactive aftermath that continues in the silence of Passy, where Marie Curie rests, contaminated and eternal. More than 90 years have passed since Marie Curie died in the silence of Passy, since consciousness departed body that could no longer sustain it, since the work ended, and the worker was buried in lead-lined coffin that testified to the danger she carried even in death. That would carry for centuries. That would outlast memory, outlast history, outlast even the institutions she helped build and the knowledge she helped discover. 90 years. Several human lifetimes. Long enough that everyone who knew her personally is gone. That direct memory has been replaced by history, that the woman has become legend, that Marie Curie is no longer person but symbol, no longer flesh but idea, no longer individual but archetype of scientific dedication, of women in science, of pursuit carried past all reasonable limits into territories where determination becomes destruction and sacrifice becomes slow suicide. But her notebooks still glow. This is not metaphor, is not symbolic, is literal, physical fact measurable with instruments, detectable in darkness, undeniable to anyone who examines the laboratory books she kept during the radium years, during the decades of handling radioactive materials without protection, without understanding that contamination was occurring. That radioactivity was being transferred from samples to pages, that the records of her work were becoming themselves radioactive, were becoming contaminated with the substances they described, were becoming dangerous in ways that would persist not for years, but for centuries, for millennia, for time scales so vast that human consciousness struggles to comprehend them. The notebooks are stored at France's Bibliothèque Nationale in lead-lined boxes, are accessible only to researchers who sign waivers acknowledging the risk, who agree to minimal handling, who understand that Marie Curie's handwriting is itself hazardous, that the pages she touched carry radiation she deposited through hands that were themselves contaminated, through flesh that had incorporated radium. Through the constant contact between radioactive fingers and paper that absorbed the contamination and holds it still, will hold it for centuries, will require protective storage until radioactivity fades to levels where casual handling becomes safe, which will not happen in our lifetimes, our children's lifetimes, or our grandchildren's lifetimes, which will require time measured in half-lives of radium-226, which decays with half-life of 1,600 years. Meaning that 16 centuries from now, the notebooks will be half as radioactive as they are today. 32 centuries from now, they will be 1/4 as radioactive, 6 to 4 centuries from now 1/8. And so on in mathematical progression that makes clear what Marie perhaps never fully understood. That some contamination is permanent for any practical definition of permanent. That some costs persist beyond individual lifetimes, beyond civilizations, beyond historical memory itself. It is said that if you take the notebooks into a dark room and wait for your eyes to adjust, you can see them glow faintly, barely, like starlight reflected in deep water, like phosphorescence in ocean darkness, like something that might be imagination except that the instruments confirm it, except that the radiation is measurable, except that the glow is real. Marie's handwriting glows. Her calculations emit radiation. The record of her work is itself contaminated with what the work studied, creating a kind of recursion, a loop where research and researcher and research record all become radioactive, all become dangerous, all become testimony to what happens when boundaries dissolve between observer and observed, between scientist and subject, between work and worker. Beneath the practical concerns about storage and handling, beneath the safety protocols and the lead-lined boxes and the waivers that researchers sign, lives a deeper truth that the glowing notebooks announce. That some work leaves marks that do not fade, that some dedication costs more than can be calculated in advance, that some pursuit of understanding transforms not just the understander, but everything the understander touches, everything associated with the work, everything that carries the signature of consciousness, that engaged so intensely with radioactivity that radioactivity engaged back, claimed her, contaminated her, and through her contaminated everything she touched her laboratory, her home. Her notebooks, her own flesh, all radioactive now, all glowing faintly, all testimony to work pursued past the point where work remains external, remains contained, remains separable from the worker. Where does dedication end and destruction begin? The glowing notebooks refuse to answer. Present only the facts. That Marie Curie handled radium without protection, that contamination was transferred, that the transfer was permanent, that the pages glow and will glow for centuries, that the cost is written not just in her death, but in the continuing radioactivity of everything she touched, everything associated with her work, everything that bears the marks of consciousness that pursued understanding without counting cost, until cost became uncountable, became measurable only in centuries, became the glow that will not fade for longer than nations exist, longer than languages persist, longer than any human institution can reasonably expect to endure. Perhaps this is the final lesson that Marie Curie teaches not through her life, but through what remains after life, not through her achievements, but through the continuing cost of achievement, not through the discoveries themselves, but through the persistent contamination that announces louder than any biography, any monument, any celebration of genius could announce. That some knowledge costs more than it benefits, or at least costs more than the knower can afford, leaves marks that persist beyond any reasonable accounting, creates hazards that outlast the benefits, glows with dangers that fade so slowly that permanence and temporary become indistinguishable, become simply the facts that must be managed, that must be contained in lead, that must be warned about across generations that had no part in the work, but that inherit its radioactive aftermath. The glow that will not fade is both tribute and warning. Tribute to dedication, so complete that contamination seemed acceptable price, seemed small cost for understanding that transformed science, that opened nuclear physics, that made possible treatments that have saved millions of lives since Marie died. But warning, too, that dedication without boundaries becomes destruction, that work without protection becomes contamination, that pursuit of knowledge without respect for biological limits becomes the slow suicide that claimed Marie and that continues in her notebooks, in her laboratory equipment, in her personal effects, all radioactive, all glowing faintly, all requiring special handling, all testimony that some costs persist, some hazards remain. Some dedication leaves marks that will not fade for longer than seems possible, then seems reasonable, then seems like anything except the ultimate irony. That the woman who discovered radium is preserved now not in memory alone, but in radioactive contamination, not in words alone, but in the actual physical glow of pages she touched, notebooks she wrote, records she kept that are themselves now records of cost, evidence of price, testimony to what happens when work becomes so consuming that worker and work merge, that boundaries dissolve, that everything becomes contaminated with what is being studied, because studying required such intimate contact, such complete dedication, such utter disregard for separation between self and subject that separation became impossible, became irrelevant, became the thing that Marie Curie sacrificed along with sleep and health and ultimately life itself, leaving only the glow beautiful in its way, terrible in its persistence, undeniable in its message. That some work leaves marks that outlast the worker by centuries, that some dedication creates dangers that persist beyond reason, that some notebooks should not be read without lead shielding and waivers acknowledging risk, because the very pages carry radiation deposited by hands that were themselves radioactive, by consciousness that had incorporated so much radium that everything it touched became contaminated, everything associated with the work became dangerous. Everything marked by Marie Curie's presence became itself radioactive in ways both literal and metaphorical, both measurable and philosophical, both scientific and symbolic of what happens when dedication to science becomes indistinguishable from destruction of the scientist, when work pursued with such intensity contaminates everything, when understanding requires sacrifices that continue long after understanding is achieved, long after achievement is celebrated, long after the achiever is dead and buried in lead-lined coffin, leaving only the notebooks that glow, the laboratory equipment that remains dangerous, the personal effects that must be handled with caution, the legacy that is both brilliant and contaminated, both achievement and warning, both triumph and tragedy, both the glow of discovery and the glow of radioactive decay that will continue for centuries, for millennia, for time beyond human comprehension, proving that Marie Curie's work is not finished, that the cost continues to accumulate, that the glow that will not fade is both tribute to her dedication and warning about what dedication costs when pursued without boundaries, without protection, without recognition that some substances contaminate everything they touch, and that consciousness which touches them too intimately becomes contaminated too, becomes itself radioactive, becomes itself the source of glow that will not fade, that cannot fade, that persists as long as radiation persists. Which is to say, almost forever, or near enough to forever that the distinction becomes meaningless, becomes simply the fact that must be lived with by all who would examine Marie Curie's notebooks, by all who would study her legacy, by all who would understand not just what she achieved, but what achievement cost, what success demanded, what understanding required from the woman who gave everything, who sacrificed completely, who pursued radioactivity until radioactivity claimed her, and claims her still through the notebooks that glow, through the contamination that persists, through the cost that continues, through the glow that will not fade for centuries to come, for millennia to follow, for as long as radium-226 continues its patient decay, for as long as radioactivity continues its indifferent half-life, for as long as the notebooks remain contaminated with the substance they describe, with the residue of hands that touched them, with the physical signature of consciousness that engaged so deeply with radioactivity that engagement became contamination, contamination became legacy, and legacy became the glow that announces across centuries. Marie Curie was here, touched these pages, pursued this understanding, paid this cost, and the payment continues still, will continue always or nearly always, will continue until time itself has lost interest, until the atoms have decayed into stability, until the glow finally, eventually, mercifully fades into the darkness where all light must go, where all radiation must end, where all costs are finally settled and all glows finally cease, but not yet, not now. Not while the notebooks still glow, not while the contamination persists, not while Marie Curie's handwriting still emits radiation measurable with instruments, visible in darkness, undeniable to anyone who looks, who measures, who understands that some dedication leaves marks that outlast dedication itself, that some work continues long after workers are gone, that some glow will not fade no matter how much time passes, no matter how much we wish it would. No matter how clearly it warns that some knowledge costs too much, some understanding requires sacrifices that should not be made, some pursuit of truth leaves us contaminated by what we discover, marked by what we touch, glowing with dangers that persist beyond life, beyond death, beyond everything except the radiation itself which continues patient and eternal, in notebooks that glow, in pages that warn, in the handwriting of Marie Curie that announces still, will announce for centuries. I was here, I discovered radium, I paid with everything, and the payment continues, the cost persists. The glow will not fade, not in your lifetime, not in your children's lifetime, not in any timeline that human consciousness can meaningfully imagine, leaving only the fact that must be faced. That Marie Curie's notebooks glow, will glow for centuries, are contaminated beyond recovery, beyond decontamination, beyond anything except the slow decay of radioactivity itself, which proceeds with patience that makes human timescales seem like brief flickers. That makes our concerns about legacy and memory, and what persists seem almost quaint when compared to the simple physical fact that radium-226 decays with half-life of 1,600 years, and that Marie Curie's contamination will persist for many such half-lives, will glow for millennia, will require lead-lined storage longer than most religions have existed, longer than recorded history extends, longer than seems possible, until you understand radioactivity, until you understand contamination, until you understand that the glow that will not fade is not metaphor, not exaggeration, not poetic device, but simple truth. Marie Curie's work glows still, will glow always or nearly always, will be the light that warns across centuries that some dedication is indistinguishable from destruction, some work from suicide, some pursuit of knowledge from the contamination that pursues the knower, that claims everything, that leaves marks that will not fade, that cannot fade, that persist as long as radioactivity persists, which is to say, for time beyond reason, beyond reckoning, beyond anything except the patient half-life of radium-226 which decays slowly, so slowly as the glow fades from Marie Curie's notebooks, which is to say, not fading at all by human measures, not diminishing in any timeline we can care about, just glowing, continuing, persisting, the light that will not fade, the contamination that will not end, the cost that continues, the warning written in radioactive ink on pages that glow faintly in darkness and will glow for centuries to come, testimony to what work cost when work became everything, when dedication became contamination. When Marie Curie pursued radium and radium pursued her and both pursuits succeeded, both achieved their goals, both produced the result they sought. Understanding, yes, and also death, knowledge, yes, and also contamination, achievement, yes, and also the glow that will not fade, the cost that will not end, the warning that speaks from notebooks stored in lead, that whispers from pages that glow, that announces with patient radiation. This is what happens when work consumes the worker, when dedication becomes destruction, when the glow we seek becomes the glow we carry, becomes the contamination we cannot shed, becomes the mark that outlasts us, that persists beyond us. That is Marie Curie's final legacy, not just the knowledge she discovered, but the cost she paid. Not just the radium she isolated, but the radiation she incorporated. Not just the notebooks she wrote, but the glow they emit. Still, always, the glow that will not fade. The end rest now. Let Marie Curie's glow fade from your thoughts as it cannot fade from her notebooks. Let the cost she paid teach the lesson she perhaps learned too late. That work is not worth life. That understanding is not worth health. That dedication must have boundaries or it becomes destruction. Close your eyes. You are allowed to rest. You are permitted to sleep. You are not required to give everything, to sacrifice completely, to pursue until pursuit consumes you. The darkness that holds you now is kind, is gentle, is the darkness of rest rather than the darkness of contamination. Sleep deeply. Sleep safely. Sleep knowing that the glow that will not fade from Marie Curie's notebooks is warning you need not learn personally, cost you need not pay yourself, sacrifice you can refuse. Good night. Sweet rest. And gratitude to Marie, who showed us through her brilliance and her suffering both, through her achievement and her cost, through her life and her death, and the radioactive aftermath that continues still, that some prices are simply too high, some dedication too complete, some glow too persistent, teaching us that rest matters, that boundaries matter, that work must not consume the worker, or it leaves only the glow, the contamination, the warning written in radiation that persists for centuries. Rest now, sleep well. Do not pay what Marie paid. Do not glow as Marie glows. Do not sacrifice as she sacrificed. Just rest, just sleep. Just allow the darkness to hold you gently, safely, in ways that do not contaminate, that do not claim forever, that allow you to wake tomorrow refreshed rather than depleted, restored rather than consumed, human rather than the radioactive remnant that is all that remains of Marie Curie, her contaminated notebooks, her lead-lined coffin, her glow that will not fade for centuries, her warning that speaks still. Rest matters, sleep matters, life matters more than work, always, even when work seems infinitely important, even when dedication seems noble, even when the glow seems beautiful. Rest matters most. Sleep matters most. And the darkness that holds you now is the darkness that heals, that restores, that allows tomorrow. That is nothing like the radioactive darkness that holds Marie Curie still, that will hold her for centuries, that glows faintly with the cost of work pursued unto death. Unto contamination, unto the glow that will not fade. Sleep now. The story is complete, and you, unlike Marie, can rest.